Okay, today we are going to finish analyzing Catcher in the Rye. So we're going to start with chapter 20, which for me is on page 165. So Holden is sitting at a bar, getting drunk, and waiting for the girls to return. And he says, "People never give your message to anybody." So this is an example where Holden considers that he does things for people, but they don't always reciprocate, or that he can't rely on or trust anyone. He makes a phone call, and Sally's grandmother answers the phone. It's late, so he doesn't really consider time for other people, and he doesn't really seem to care. You know, he's on his own time schedule, and he is kind of apathetic about how other people feel. So, yeah, he talks to Sally, and he's just not very nice and says things that, aren't the greatest, which he acknowledges. He says, "When I'm drunk, I'm a madman." And he says, "I always shiver like hell when I'm drunk." So Holden is stuck in kind of a childhood mentality, but he drinks like an adult. So he should be starting the adult world, or at least transitioning to it. And he does a little, and that's where he feels lonely because he's still embracing childhood. He's not ready for that transition, even though his age and his school and everything requires it of him. And he does drink alcohol, but he doesn't react to it well. He doesn't like it. So he talks about crying and feeling depressed and lonely. He's isolated and lonely because everyone he knows is making the transition to the adult world except him. And so he's feeling left out, which makes sense. So, yeah. Let's see. He contemplates death. And he says, "Who wants flowers when you're dead? Nobody." So it's more for other people that they do the flowers rather than for himself. Yeah, and he gets out of the park, goes home. He's cold, and nobody was around. So again, he's physically isolated right now. So that's how chapter 20 ends. It's kind of depressing, which some people would argue a lot of this book is kind of depressing. In chapter 21, let's see. He goes to his house and he's trying to see Phoebe, but he says he's going to his neighbor's place, the Dicksteins. And he says, like, you say something nobody understands, and they'll do practically anything you want them to do, which is an interesting technique. So to continue, he goes home, he goes into Phoebe's room, and she's not there. But he goes into DB's room, his brother's room, and there's Phoebe asleep. And he complains that adults look bad when they're sleeping, but that kids look all right. They can have spit on the pillow and look all right, which is why, it's another sign that he's more attracted to childhood in general, not romantically. It's just something that he's drawn to. And then he sees that Phoebe wrote Weatherfield as her middle name, even though her middle name is Josephine, which she doesn't like. So he thinks that's kind of funny. So they talk. And he says that Phoebe's really smart. In some ways, you could argue that Phoebe is more mature than he is, more capable to handle life or even the adult world. So he likes to keep an eye on her. He calls her a madman as well. And then we're in chapter 22. So she takes the pillow off of her head. And he talks to her about school. And he just says that he's sick of everyone. It's a bad school. It was full of phonies and mean people. So he just comes up with reasons for why school was not a good fit for him. She listens to him, which is nice, even though she doesn't really respond. I don't think Holden feels like many people understand him or even listen. They kind of zone out, but Phoebe listens. He says there were a few nice teachers, but they are phony too. And he talks about Mr. Spencer. She criticizes how much he curses. And then she says, you don't like anything that's happening. So this is something that can be common with some people. They just complain about everything. They don't see the benefit in anything. And actually, you can train your brain to do otherwise. So if you find that you're always criticizing or finding fault with people, hey, there's a lot to criticize these days. But if you don't want to be like that, you can retrain your brain and retrain the synapses in your brain to focus more on the positive. And that can change your outlook and perspective in life. So it's something to consider. But he says he does like things, and she's like, you don't like any schools, you don't like a million things, you don't. And so she's depressing him. And he can't concentrate. When he's trying to think of one thing he likes a lot or even a little, he just thinks about two nuns that collects the straw baskets. So then he goes on this tangent. And so he is philosophical in some ways, but not in the adult or mature manner where he can really dive deeply into an idea. He's more stuck in the childhood mentality where it's superficially analyzing things or thinking about things, maybe not even getting to analysis. So let's see, he knew this boy, James Castle, at Elkton Hills, and he dies, and he was wearing one of Holden's sweaters. So this is another example of death that is rather disturbing to Holden. Of course, Allie's death is the most disturbing, but those are two examples of childhood deaths. One is his brother, and one is connected to him because he's wearing the sweater. And the boys didn't even go to jail. So he hardly knew him. Yeah. And then he says that he likes Allie, that to finally answer Phoebe's question after his tangent. And she's like, Allie's dead. And so she tries to bring him back to reality. And then we get to page 91, and this is a really key part where we analyze a poem by Robert Burns. And he says, if a body catch a body coming through the rye. And Phoebe says, if a body meet a body coming through the rye. It's a poem by Robert Burns. So you might want to check that out, and that might be on a test. Holden says, I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Nobody's around, nobody big, except me. So big is a euphemism for adults. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start going off the cliff. If they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to catch them. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all. So that's his interpretation of the line, and that's the title of the book, which is why it's important. So the rye field is a metaphor, and if you look at the title of the book, and you could argue that this is an extended metaphor, but it's kind of a stretch. An extended metaphor is a metaphor that lasts an entire book or a huge section. But in a rye field, you can't see over it, so you can't see the cliff that you might be going over. For Holden, this means that falling over the cliff is the transition to adulthood. So by keeping the kids from going over, they are staying safe. They're kind of staying in his version of Neverland. The more I read and analyze this text, the more I feel like you can make connections to Peter Pan. So he sees himself as keeping kids innocent, and safe, and preventing them from going to adulthood, which in his experience is violent and mean and isolating and depressing, and no one seems to understand him, and so it's not a good place. Now, you should look at the poem by Robert Burns because the meaning is actually very different, but it comes with another universal truth or a big idea that's in this book, which is sexuality. If a body meet a body coming through the rye. So this is, takes place before today. And so what it means is like, oh, if you want to meet with the person that you're attracted to and you're in the rye, the field is high, you can't see anyone, like, is it okay to kiss them? Is it okay to go further than that? Go into more risque, past PG-13 behavior. And that's something that Holden, again, doesn't want to think about. Sexuality scares him, whether it's homosexuality or heterosexuality, it doesn't matter. The idea of sex just scares him right now. And so it's interesting, just one change of the word, and this is kind of a close reading, to just see, okay, catch versus meet. And if we were to look at the actual poem, how else could we analyze it to see the differences in Holden's interpretation versus an actual literary analysis of it? So I would recommend looking at the poem and seeing what else you can see. So Holden's interpretation is analyzing it in terms of keeping kids in innocence, and the actual poem is about sexuality and how far can you go in your actions, and is it still okay? Very different. And then he decides to call his teacher Mr. Antolini. That's how chapter 22 ends. Now we're on chapter 23. He calls Mr. Antolini by his full name. He was the one who picked up James Castle's body, which could look kind of like another person who protects kids. Of course, teachers protect kids. That's like really our goal. Let's see. He dances. And then the front door opens and it's his parents. He gets the smoke out of the room and he hides from his parents. So Phoebe lies to her parents. And then Holden says he's going to go. And he says, no, I should go right now. And he asks Phoebe for money, and she gives him her Christmas money, which is really nice. And so it's $8.85 or 65 cents because she spent some, and which in this time period could get you a lot, believe it or not. And then Holden starts crying because of her generosity and her kindness. Because this is the first time that someone actually does something for him, which is really nice. So then he goes to Mr. Antolini's house, and he sees Mr. Antolini kind of like himself as a person who's going to protect kids and protect him, and he kind of is wearing rose-colored glasses when it comes to Mr. Antolini. So he answers the door, and he thought Holden might have a baby in his arms because who calls their teacher like that? But no, he doesn't. Let's see. You could tell he was a little oiled up, so they had been drinking, and they entertained some friends. So they just had a dinner party, so there's glasses all over and dishes, and so it's not as organized as it could normally be. Let's see. He asks about English, I think it's really interesting that Holden wants to see a teacher. I feel like most students and teachers get really awkward when we see each other outside of the school setting. But it's like, what do you talk to a student about outside of the classroom? So he starts with English and about why he flunked. And Holden talks about digressions and how he finds digressions to be interesting. And Holden, as Mr. Antolini asks, well, don't you find it frustrating? He's like, well, you can't have him stick too much to the point. So he talks about that. And then Mr. Antolini gently says, well, isn't there a time and place for everything? Are digressions necessary? And so he's pushing Holden to think more analytically, to get more philosophical, to think more like an adult. And then Holden starts to get a headache and feels lousy and has a stomach ache. And so he's feeling uncomfortable that his teacher is pushing him intellectually. And luckily, Mrs. Antolini comes in carrying coffee and cakes to kind of break the tension. She says she's a mess. So she has curlers in her hair, doesn't have lipstick on, and doesn't look very pretty. So again, the rose-colored glasses are coming off. He's seeing them as they are, rather than with the rose-colored glasses on. And so Mr. Antolini had coffee with his dad. And so he's aware of how Holden's behaved in his classes, and Holden doesn't want to discuss it. And Mr. Antolini doesn't know what to say because he probably sees potential in Holden, but Holden's not acting on it. And then Mr. Antolini says, I have a feeling that you're writing for some kind of terrible, terrible fall, but I honestly don't know what kind. Are you listening to me? And so he's a little tipsy or drunk, and so he's trying to focus too, but there's 2 falls or more. So remember earlier on in another video, we talked about Paradise Lost and how Adam and Eve had a fall and could no longer be in paradise. They had to leave the Garden of Eden. And then Holden is worried about protecting kids from falling into adulthood. So kind of the loss of innocence and that transition from childhood to adulthood. There's another type of fall that's connected to the adulthood one, which is sexuality. And Mr. Antolini isn't necessarily talking about either of those here, in my opinion. He could be. You could make that argument. I think he's talking about adulthood. And if Holden doesn't get his act together and start taking school seriously, he's not going to have a future. If he continues to isolate himself by not having that mental maturity and transitioning into his teenage years and adulthood, he's going to be lonely and isolated, which will cause a lot of problems. He needs something for his future. He needs either academics or friendships or both, ideally both. And so he's trying to help Holden, but he doesn't know how. And he says, this fall I think you're writing for, it's a special kind of fall, a horrible kind. So, yeah. And he says, the mark of an immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, while the mark of a mature man is that he wants to live humbly for one. So they talk about life and death, and that's another big idea that's in this book, especially with childhood deaths. And he's like, you have to apply yourself in school, you have to. And he knows that Holden loves knowledge. And he says it's not only that educated and scholarly men are able to contribute something valuable to the world. It's not so. But if they're brilliant and creative to begin with, which is rarely the case, they tend to leave infinitely more valuable records behind. So you can make a difference, but you might not be remembered in history unless you have an education or records. Of course, Mr. Antolini is a teacher. He values education. So Holden's going to sleep, And he wakes up, and this is another key point in the book, and he felt something on his head, some guy's hand. And Holden totally freaks out. And so this is another controversial passage. We're getting into the big idea of sexuality again. He thinks that Mr. Antolini is flirting with him, and by touching his head. And so he thinks that Mr. Antolini is homosexual, and Holden feels very uncomfortable by perhaps sexual urges that he's feeling by having someone touch his head, or homosexuality in general. It just depends. Remember, it wasn't as socially acceptable when Catcher in the Rye was written as it is today. But again, he's uncomfortable with sexuality in general. And there's a fine line when your teacher is like asking you about your life to thinking that someone is flirting with you. And so he's totally, it depends on how you read it. You could say that Mr. Antolini's flirting with him and making sexual or romantic advances on Holden. And that's how Holden interprets it. Another interpretation, which is how I read it the first time, is that Mr. Antolini sees Holden as like a surrogate kid who's struggling and lonely and in a lot of emotional pain. And you want to touch someone like that. You want to make them feel better. And so it's just like a kid who's crying or upset. You want to give them a hug. You want to give them pats on the head or something just to console them. And so that's how I interpreted it even before I had kids. So I saw it as completely platonic and something to make him feel better. And perhaps you guys are reading it more like I did, especially after the pandemic when you're not supposed to touch anyone and a lot of us are feeling a lot of physical isolation, because physical touch is important to humans in general as a species. Like, we do need it. And so Holden has gone to boarding schools with boys, like no one touches him, just platonically, just like a high five or something. And so he doesn't know how to interpret when someone physically touches him. And so maybe you guys see it more the platonic way like I do, or your generation might just see it differently, or you might see the sexual side. It really depends on looking at other passages in the book and how you interpret this text as a whole. But it is controversial. So Holden, now we're in chapter 25. He gets outside. And Holden acknowledges maybe he was only patting my head for the hell of it. And he talks about hormones. So he knows, yeah. He talks about depression again, walks up Fifth Avenue. He feels like he's going to disappear, so he starts talking to his brother. So you can see he's having more and more emotional issues. He wants to go out west. And he writes Phoebe this note telling her to meet him at the Museum of Art so he can give her her money back. Gives the note to the principal. And he sees F.U. written on the wall, and it makes him really upset because Phoebe and all the other little kids would see it. And that makes him upset because he's protecting innocence. He wants to protect Phoebe. But he goes kind of to the extreme and wants to kill whoever has written it, which is rather a strong response. But again, he sees himself as the protector of innocence as his role. He calls another teacher Old Spencer, so you can see like a difference in respect between Mr. Antolini and Old Spencer with the use of titles. Again, we're looking at just single words for close readings, but shows a sign of respect. He sees another F.U. on the wall and tries to rub it off, but it's scratched in. And it just makes him really upset that kids can't hide it from them. He thinks it's funny that the kids are talking about tunes, like cartoons, instead of tombs, where mummies are. So he laughs about that, even though he also misremembered the line in Robert Burns' poem. They get scared, and so he's the only one left. He liked it. It was peaceful and quiet. No one's there to hurt his trust or disappoint him. Then he sees another F.U. on the wall. And and this is kind of his idea of adulthood. Every time you start to feel comfortable or happy in a place that's nice and peaceful, there isn't anything. And so he jokes in a very dark humor kind of way that on his tombstone, it'll have his name, the year he was born and died, and then it'll say F you, which is dark. So then Phoebe comes and she brings a suitcase. She wants to come with him. He doesn't want her to. He feels very strongly that he dislikes her. And he wants to make her cry. She's supposed to be Benedict Arnold, which, is the role of a traitor, which is kind of interesting, even though she doesn't betray him. He makes sure she goes back to school. She tells him to shut up, which he thinks sounds terrible, which is kind of how adults talk to each other. She doesn't walk near him at the zoo, which again, a zoo could be a metaphor for something. Like, are we all living in a zoo? I don't know. He encourages her to go on the carousel. She thinks she's too big. He doesn't think she is. The song Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is playing, which is a jazz song. And again, it means like you can't see something clearly. It's kind of similar to being in a rye field. You can't see clearly. But he likes to see Phoebe acting like a kid. It starts to rain. But Holden feels happy. And he's just enjoying his time with her. So now we get to chapter 26, which is the last chapter, and it's extremely long. But that's all he writes. So now he goes kind of into the future. He knows, we know that he's working with a psychoanalyst and asking if he's going to apply himself or actually live up to his potential in school next year. And Holden's like, well, how do you know? You can have the intentions, but you don't really know how you're going to act. He criticizes his brother. And he just says that he's sorry he told so many people about his story, because then he misses everyone he told, even Stratladder and Ackley. So he says, don't tell anybody anything. If you do, you start missing everybody. So he's lonely, even the people he dislikes. It seems like he's working through some of his problems, but that he's still lonely and isolated and reacts as if people don't really understand who he is. And that is another universal human truth is, do we ever let our walls down enough for people to understand who we are? And if we don't, it is a very isolating experience. And so how do we do that? So there's the transition to adulthood, childhood innocence, sexuality, identity, friendships, the role of education, the role of teachers, and loneliness and depression, and how do you handle those things? So although the language is informal and maybe you disliked it at times, there are a lot of universal human truths and questions that we can analyze and see at least how Holden and the narrator interpret them. So whether you liked it or not, I hope you found the literary merit in this text.